Yes, it's a very remarkable history of television news in India. And actually, if you trace it, it hasn't been that long, but it has covered a lot of landmarks. I'll begin with the launch of Doordarshan, which is, of course, the national broadcaster, the public broadcaster today. It was launched in 1959. In fact, it completed 60 years in September 2019. And it was launched as an experimental broadcast at that time. And only in 1965 did it start a daily transmission, which also used to include news as well. In the 1970s, it was separated from All India Radio and it became what it is today. But the real landmark for Doordarshan came in 1982 when it truly went national. So a lot of centers were set up all across the country which could receive the Doordarshan signal. In 1982, it broadcasted by its own history Indira Gandhi's Independence Day speech of the year. And the real landmark came when there was live telecast in color in 1982 of the Asian Games. So that was the initial history of broadcast, telecast that included news, live and current events as well. But the true revolution as far as what we think of television news today came in the late 1980s. That was when a few private players or independent players and bodies came into news broadcast. So around 1988, Doordarshan opened up to launch The World This Week, which was a 1 hour bulletin on international events that was broadcasted weekly, which was anchored by Pranoy Roy, who had launched, of course, NDTV, New Delhi Television, with his wife as well. So that was the first program of its kind that Indian audiences could watch. It had little to do with India events. It was largely focused on international events. A lot of their reports used to come from foreign agencies and they used to package it and anchor it and put it across, and it was a weekly show. The other big revolution that happened in India was the launch of News Track by Madhu Trehan, who had of course been associated with the launch of India Today, the magazine, as well, with her brother Arun Puri. So News Track was a really novel innovation. It was a monthly subscription of a social human interest newsy story bulletin that was anchored and reported from all across India on VHS tapes. So you could take a subscription of those tapes or you could rent the tapes from video stores. And that was how you could get some original content, original reporting, apart from what DD was broadcasting at that time. So you can imagine how revolutionary it was, and despite the fact that it was a subscription model at the time and was truly novel and innovative and revolutionary, it had great success. So did the programs that were launched by DD as well by some private producers. So News Track, for example, did stories on a rape case where the police was the accused in Bihar. And you could imagine that for the very first time, you had stories like these that were impacting Indian society being reported on by Indian reporters in their regional accents, not the very foreign accent that people were used to at that time, in a very state-run, state-driven broadcast, very controlled fashion. True emotions of stories used to come out through this. And they were also the first ones to truly grasp the power of the visual as far as television news is concerned. So one of their first stories was Children of Punjab, which tackled the story of Punjab militancy, which was at its height at that time. Another important coverage that News Track did at the time was obviously the Mandal politics. And many say that because of their coverage of showing students who were agitating on the streets being beaten up by the police really led to the fall of the VP government at that time. So the true power of the television medium, and especially one that tackled news and current events, was beginning to show and make its presence felt in the late 1980s. The true revolution, though, as far as news channels is concerned, the ones that we see today, started in late 1990s. Around 1998 is when both Star News and Zee News launched. These were the first two private-run 24/7 channels in India. And they began the coverage, the kind of coverage that we see today, but at that time it was very different. It wasn't what it is today. It was a lot of repeat bulletins. Star News used to do both English and Hindi. Zee News was the first purely Hindi 24/7 news channel. They, of course, used to have their reporters who used to go out and report, but it wasn't a lot of live coverage because there wasn't the technology available at that time to do a lot of live coverage. So it was a lot of packaged news. Reporters would go to the ground and they used to use DSMG machines to uplink their stories, script their stories. The stories would be edited and those would be put together in news bulletins. It was very traditional. And as many from the era have said, it was a very small scale industry, almost a cottage industry, a lot of trial and error when the first 24/7 news channel started in India. They brought in a lot of innovation through the years, but at that time it was still very nascent and very traditional. A professional run setup, but very traditional in its outlook. It was all about putting together 10 to 11 big stories of the day, of the week, to the viewer in half an hour bulletins and so on and so forth. Before that, though, the Doordarshan had opened itself a little bit more. So from a weekly show, then there were daily news shows, for example, that NDTV used to do, for which also there used to be reporters who used to go to the ground and bring back coverage. But tapes of the half an hour show would be sent to the DD office and they would be censored then. Not anything and everything could go. So it was produced by a private company, but there was a lot of influence that DD had, and there was a lot of censorship that used to happen at that time. So when the private run channel started in around 1998 with Star News and Z News, that's when the channel revolution started. As I mentioned, there weren't a lot of OB vans at that time. So the live element was very restricted. It was used to be more packaged stories and packaged bulletins, a lot of repeat as well. But one of the first phenomenon of live coverage that started at that time in the late 1990s was election coverage. You know, today election coverage, we all are very familiar with it. It starts early in the morning on verdict day, and within 4 to 5, 6 hours maybe you have your trends, and virtually the final result can be predicted, and it's a matter of only a few seats left because of course we have EVMs today. The counting has become much faster, but you can imagine in the pre-EVM era, counting used to take nearly 2 days. So election coverage was really fascinating. It used to run nearly 2 days, sometimes 3 days for the results to come in. And at that time, Star and Z and others, for example, used to do continuous coverage with a lot of chat in the studio, and guests used to come in the studio as well, but not so much live from the ground because the technology was still limited. It was around 1999 that OB vans became usual, so people could do live coverage. Another landmark was also the coverage, for example, of the Kargil war. It wasn't live by any standards, but it was faster than it would have been, and it was private. It wasn't just what Doordarshan was doing. The Kutch earthquake in 2001 or the Gujarat riots in 2002. These were the first few events where the power of television media and power of television news first came to the fore. But it was really a very exciting time because some of the formats that we know of today were first introduced in the revolution of private news channels in late 1990s, around 1998, 1999. For example, The Big Fight on NDTV started in 1999. It was the first of its kind debate show that of course has taken a leap today in 2019. And Aapki Adalat by Rajat Sharma was also the first of its kind show, which is still running. Both of these shows are still running formats, and they were the first of their kind at that time. So we had a couple of private 24/7 news channels in Star News and Z News, but it still wasn't what it is today. The real competition in the market was brought in by the launch of Aaj Tak in 2001. That not only brought in a lot of competition, broke the monopoly of the Hindi-English NDTV produced Star News or the Z News, which ran completely in Hindi. It also brought in a lot of speed, a lot of innovation, and it really took the news to the masses. So as you can see, in just about a decade, from the mid 1980s to the mid 1990s, or the late 1980s to the late 1990s, a vast revolution had taken place in the way news was presented in India. It became less state driven, less orthodox, less traditional. Of course, private players came in, so there were more voices that you could hear and more point of view that was presented. It also became more on the spot, faster, with a lot of speed and competition as far as accuracy and speed is concerned. The other difference that it made when private run channels began to broadcast news in India was, of course, the quality. One, it became less straight driven, less orthodox, less traditional. The quality improved, the presentation improved, it became slicker, faster, the studios became better, and also the graphics were much slicker than before. The next landmark event was the launch of CNN IBN by Rajdeep Sardesai, who was earlier with NDTV with other players in 2005, and the launch of Times Now with Arnab Goswami as the editor-in-chief. Now, these two broke the monopoly of NDTV as the only English 24/7 channel and really brought in the large-scale mass revolution that we see today, where we have anywhere close to 800 to 1,000 news channels in the country. So this is where, in the mid-2000s, when the floodgates were really open, you can imagine how it broke the monopoly of a few individuals or a few channels, how it increased competition. Earlier, big guests, big politicians used to come to studios because there was very little competition or demand on their time, and there weren't any OBs, so they had to come to the studios. Today, of course, access to leaders has become much more limited for journalists because there are just so many around. This is really the time when the floodgates were open in India. So from 1998, Star News and Zee News, to the launch of Republic TV in 2017. It's just been 20 years. It's not that long a time in the evolution of any industry, and yet the television news landscape has changed completely in the last 2 decades. The launch of Republic TV, for example, also brought in another landmark shift where the editor-in-chief, Arnab Goswami, is also the owner of the network, something we hadn't seen earlier.